Hey everyone, it's Dr. Robinson. I'm going to go over 12-step facilitation of treatment. So basically we're talking about AA, so Alcoholics Anonymous. We're going to talk about the variations of Alcoholics Anonymous, and then some of the different um, groups that have sprung from that. But we're really going to talk about the philosophy of it. And your assignment asks that you do you look at this PowerPoint, you listen to my reading, and then you read how it works from the Big Book. The Big Book is essentially the Bible for 12-step groups and for AA. It was written in 1935, so you'll notice as you read that the language is difficult to understand, and it's not language that we use today, and so it can be a bit confusing. And if you'd like, you can talk about that in your discussion piece. So essentially, 12-step or AA, what I really want you to know about this is that it is not a therapeutic group. It is this, well, in the way that we think about it from counseling, it is a self-help group. These are peer-led support groups. These are not therapeutic counseling groups. There is a therapeutic component to it, but any group, even if it's just you and your friend who meet weekly over coffee, that there's some sort of therapeutic element to it. But I think to distinguish it, from our perspective as counselors, is not a true counseling therapeutic group. It's a self-help group. There are groups that do not rely on the 12 steps, but traditionally what we use today are traditional 12-step AA-based groups. There are meetings in person and on the internet, and this is why I asked you guys to choose one of the groups that you attend in person and one online. Don't forget you have to do that. And so this is voluntary. People can go, people cannot go. There's no sort of the bit of accountability is with you and your sponsor, and therapists have very little involvement in whether or not their client goes to a 12-step group or not. And as a matter of fact, considering our boundaries and our ethics, it would be really unethical for you to intertwine yourself with that aspect. You can refer your clients to 12-step groups. You can talk about what it is like in a 12-step group for your client, how it's beneficial, how it's not beneficial. But this is a separate group outside of your work. If you work in a treatment center, you will more than likely utilize 12-step and AA principles as part of your work with clients, just because most traditional treatment centers use this approach. You see this second to last bullet point I have here, that it's consistently linked with achievement of abstinence. That's somewhat confusing, and we're going to get to that in just half a second as we scroll down. There's a reason why it's linked to achievement and abstinence that is not rooted in research. So just keep that on the back burner. But again, you need to be familiar with these because you're going to be this is what we use, whether we like it or not. This is what we use traditionally for treatment for AA. For addictive use disorder. So, Alcoholics Anonymous was founded in 1935. I'm not going to go too much into that, other than to say that it's an offshoot of something called the Oxford Group, and really the idea was former addicts, and I'm going to use that word purposefully right now because 12-step and AA refers to individuals as addicts. Even though you guys heard me in the very beginning say I don't particularly like that label, I'm going to use that in this chapter as I'm discussing it. So the principle was that former addicts would help individuals who are struggling with alcoholism, because this was started as Alcoholics Anonymous. They would use their personal experience as a means to keeping themselves sober and helping someone else stay sober. And in the Big Book, the chapter 5 that I have for you guys, you'll see it's literally titled How It Works, so you'll see the process that's used. They're not the first They're not the first group of individuals to utilize this concept of using their personal experience to help someone else in recovery. As a matter of fact, Native Americans were, what we know, at least the information that we have, Native Americans were the first people to use their personal experience to help others. in recovering from alcoholism. So I want to make sure that we give credit to the American Indian population for that. Alcoholics Anonymous were by no means the first people to think of this. And again, Oxford Group came before Alcoholics Anonymous, so this is yet another sort of offshoot. There's 12 steps and 12 traditions. Again, whenever you read how it works, you'll see what that means. The goal is that every step and every principle and every action that is done through AA is to maintain sobriety. And AA identifies sobriety as abstinence. So nothing, no alcohol. If you go the other substances, no heroin. There's no real harm reduction or moderation approach that fits with this pure philosophy. Now, some AA has recently allowed for, depending upon the group you go to, there may be some allowances for abstinence being defined differently than abstinence, true abstinence. And AA and 12-step approaches are just now sort of coming around to the idea of using medication for treatment. So like Suboxone or methadone, that's typically and traditionally been frowned upon in this approach. But as we progress and as we evolve, more and more AA-based programs or treatment centers are having to allow for that, because we know medically and physiologically these things work. So a couple of different sort of off groups or subgroups off of this Al-Anon. It's for the families. So it's the same 12-step and 12 traditions, but it is applied to families. Codependents Anonymous, CODA, are, that's sort of a, codependent is a word that's going by the wayside, because it's awfully labeling and sort of victimizing. But nonetheless, this is a group that is for the other individuals in the family who may be hindering or supporting the one with the addictive use disorder. Remember, in this chapter, we can call them addicts, but the ones who may be sort of impeding or supporting in roundabout ways their use. So keeping them sick, keeping them using, and usually this happens because it satisfies a need for them. And maybe they're a caretaker and they need someone to take care of. Narcotics Anonymous, these are it's less, so an NA approach is less God or religious themed as you read the book, but it's the same AA approach. Alateen, these are for, it's the supportive group for teenagers. Rational recovery, I need to take this slide out actually. If you can replace this with smart recovery. And so it's cognitive behavioral based as opposed to religious. There's a little less defined parameters around what sobriety is. So there's a little bit more allowance for moderation or harm reduction approaches. And then there's no steps. There's no religious overtones. It's more, you can see here, emphasis on self-efficacy. So really putting the emphasis on what strengths the client has and what strengths the client can use on their own without being so directive. Group process. So you guys did a whole chapter on group, and then you have a whole class on group. So I don't want to sort of beat a dead horse. But when it comes to AA, remember that these are not, in what we think as counselors, true therapeutic groups. There's therapeutic components, and it can be therapeutic, but they are not counseling groups. That needs to be distinguished. But they can be meetings where they talk about the book, they talk about the 12 steps and the traditions. They can be open or closed, meaning, that you either have to sign up and then that's it, or people can come and go. Most of them are open. When you get into SA meetings, so sex addicts or Sexaholics Anonymous groups, those are usually closed because of just the pure nature of the content that's going to be discussed. There are speaker meetings, step meetings, big book meetings. So these are all just the different types of meetings that can happen around the AA principle. It's voluntary. They support and promote anonymity and confidentiality. That's why you hear people go by their first name, last initial. So if I were an AA member, and if I were in a group, it would be my first name with my last initial. That's how I would identify myself, and I would call myself an addict. You would identify yourself as I'm Stephanie R., and I'm an addict. I'm an alcoholic. I am a heroin addict. There's an identification that everyone does. I'm curious, again, as you write your discussion piece, I'm curious as to your thought and philosophy on sort of that identification, or that means of identifying a group member. That you notice here that the counselor really doesn't have a role in here, that these are member-led, and it's all voluntary, and that the counselor isn't present here. Sponsor, this is real important. So the addict is tasked with finding a sponsor, and the sponsor takes them through the 12 steps and through the big book. Their sponsor is their guide. Their sponsor is someone who is in recovery. So they have their own struggles with an addictive use disorder, and they're using their personal experience to, one, help the individual become sober, and to help their own sobriety. Sponsorship can get mucky, can get a little mucky or a little messy, because there's no ethical code around sponsorship. There can be some super blurred boundaries. And when we talk about individuals with addictive use disorders, we already know that they struggle with boundaries, and they struggle with impulse control just by nature of having an addictive use disorder. So when you're talking sponsorship, again, there's no ethical code. I've heard horror stories where, sponsors are sleeping with their sponsees, sponsors are loaning sponsees money, sponsors relapse, and then they essentially abandon their sponsee. I mean, you can think of a million scenarios, but, all those can be quite problematic. So this is what I was referencing early on. So there's very little research in whether or not 12-step and AA really works. It's all self-selection, and it's all based off self-report. And then, of course, that definition of abstinence is pretty strict. So while it's associated with positive outcomes, we're asking people, because this is not research-based all that much. This isn't evidence-based. But you're asking people to self-identify, self-report, and you're traditionally only getting people who have been going to meetings. So the figures are quite high, but we're very confused about how they get these numbers. Advantages, it's consistent, it's free, it can appeal to almost all demographics, and I say almost all because the individuals have to be okay with the idea that they're sharing these personal bits about themselves in a group environment. So I ran a group at one point for people who maybe had some high-profile jobs and could not just walk into any meeting because it would be a detriment to their careers. And so, considering that, just walking into any meeting would be really difficult for them. But here you can see, there are some great benefits to it. Disadvantages: limited empirical support and super inconsistent. May become overly dependent. I might need these meetings, and as a matter of fact, AA tells you do in fact need these meetings, and you need to go to all of them, and you need to go to a lot of them. Well, we are counselors, and so we rely a lot on the strengths of the client, and we would like the clients to ultimately not need us. That's the best. We don't want them to need us, and so AA says they do need us. Bad advice from other members. Again, these aren't counselors. I talked about boundaries. And then there's a Christian foundation. God is mentioned a lot. Regardless, you need to know about it. You need to know about 12-step. You need to know how it works, and you need to know about